Very happy to be here and get the chance to talk with you guys tonight. So when I was asked to take part in this lecture series, I was writing about 2 novels of academic life. And I thought these novels might provide a bridge between the philosophy of education and my own field of literary studies. Now, I use the phrase deliberately, novels of academic life, rather than the more familiar term, academic novel, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, the kind of satire of the manners and mores of the university, as embodied, say, by Lucky Jim or the novels of David Lodge, Trading Places, for example. So these books are rather different. The novels I'm going to be talking about today, the first is Stoner by John Williams. I'm not assuming you know either of these books, so perhaps you may do so. And then Theory by Dion Brand. They, as I say, are marked by a quite different sensibility. They're certainly critical of academic institutions, but they also hone in on the existential and emotional force of intellectual commitments. How books and ideas can come to define a sense of who one is. For me, writes the narrator of Theory, for me, meaning is a source of life and death. Could resonance, which is this concept elaborated by the German social theorist Hartmut Rosa, speak to the force of attachments to both literature and theory without pitting one against the other? Now, in certain respects, these 2 novels I'm going to be talking about could not be more dissimilar. The protagonist of the first novel, of Williams' novel, is a retiring, kind of timid, antisocial scholar of medieval and Renaissance literature in early 20th century Missouri. And he seems like a very unlikely counterpart to Brand's PhD student, who quotes Adorno and Althusser, Fanon and Winter, and is planning to write, quote, a bomb of a thesis that will blow up the building. Not only does the object of attachment differ in these 2 novels, but Stoner's restrained but lyrical realism has little in common with Theory's experiment in unreliable narration. In Brand's text, race and gender are foundational categories of thought, while the maleness and whiteness of University of Missouri goes unnoticed not only by Stoner's characters, but also seemingly by the author. In both novels, though, the university is depicted from the perspective of non-traditional students, weighed down by inequities of either class or race, who lack the social savvy of their peers, for whom the heady allure of books is accompanied by a steady thrum of alienation from academic institutions. And both novels, in portraying what might look like professional failure, invite us to rethink what might be defined as success. And this speaks to an aspect of these novels that makes them perhaps a surprising choice for a lecture in an institute of education. While the protagonists of both novels resonate deeply with the books they read, they cannot translate their intellectual excitement into interpersonal engagement. Stoner, as we'll see, is an uninspiring teacher who's soon forgotten by his students. And while Brand's narrator never mentions working as a teaching assistant, we can feel reasonably confident that her performance in the classroom will be little short of catastrophic. Why then do these protagonists interest me? Precisely because they do not lend themselves to being recruited as inspiring exemplars or role models. To invoke Rosa's categories, they struggle to combine vertical resonance, in other words, attachment to some higher realm of art or ideas, with horizontal resonance, empathy and attunement with other human beings. This is, I think, a not entirely unfamiliar issue in higher education. Well, we all have colleagues who can combine groundbreaking research with spectacular teaching. For some of us, things are not so straightforward. As an introvert, I've always found teaching much more challenging than writing. And it cannot help but identify with some of the interpersonal failures of the figures I will discuss. Like them, I was inspired by books and ideas. And it took me a painfully long time to realize that many students need, in fact, to be inspired by the teachers of those books and ideas. And perhaps as a result, representations of the classroom in, say, film often strike me as treacly and false, glossing over or too easily surmounting the difficulties of teaching, and in the case of Dead Poets Society, the difficulties of literature. So it's here, I think, that Rosa's concept of resonance may prove generative. In recent books on higher education, a more affirmative language is coming to the fore. We might think of Kathleen Fitzpatrick's Manifesto for Generous Thinking, a Radical Approach to Saving the University, she calls it, Keith Gannon's Advocacy for Radical Hope, or the references to love in the Manifesto for Post-Critical Pedagogy. So generosity, love, hope. And here I want to make a case for resonance as perhaps an especially apposite concept for the question of both teaching and research. Because as we'll see, resonance is not an emotion, but a relation. It's less concerned with either prescribing or proscribing feelings than with clarifying the conditions for genuine engagement. I retain enough from Foucault to have reservations about the increasingly therapeutic language of higher education. The insistence, relayed in countless emails and instructional videos, that we not only teach, but nurture, support, and console our students, or more cynically, keep consumers happy. Such bureaucratically enforced empathy takes little account of variations in temperament among both teachers and students. The aloof, the diffident, the cynical, the neurodiverse. Moreover, as Rosa insists, resonance is not synonymous with harmony or happiness. What excites us can also be a source of anxiety or discomfort. Resonance is often intertwined with estrangement, even conflict, such that, as he says, one experiences both resonance and alienation, not blended into a hybrid form, but in a relation of mutual escalation. Such a dialectic seems better suited to the complexities of our psychic and social lives, as well as our experiences of education. So Rose is a key figure in a book I've just finished, which will be out with Chicago next year, called Selective Affinities, Literature and New Critical Theory. And it's a book that deals with contemporary German social theorists, or as they call themselves, usually social philosophers, in the Frankfurt School tradition, whose work is terra incognita in the humanities. For example, Axel Honneth, Rahel Yegi, Robin Selikatis, and Nicholas Kompridis, as well as Rosa. So why do I write a book about these people who are completely unknown in literary studies? Well, because their orientation reveals some striking parallels with current debates in literary studies along two main axes. First, in contrast to those critical theories that demand a radical break with everyday self-understanding, German thought is now grappling with the complexities of such self-understanding. There's been a kind of major turn towards a kind of social phenomenology, if you like. So Rahel Yegi, for example, has been praised for her attention to everyday experience, sketching portraits of individuals afflicted by a sense of powerlessness, unreality, or self-division, while probing the philosophical depths of such malaise and the many kind of dimensions of the self's relation to the self. So first of all, a kind of phenomenological turn, if you like. And secondly, again, this obviously relates to some of the issues around post-critique, German thinkers are developing an extensive repertoire of affirmative concepts. Without giving up on critique, they highlight the limits of skepticism and suspicion. Many adherents of critical theory, says Rosa, believe that critique should be purely negative. A vital critical theory needs to do more than this. Similarly, Nicholas Kompridis remarks, it's not sufficient to unmask power relations. One also needs to initiate alternative ways of being, going on with our everyday practices differently. So this book is organized around a series of ideas developed by these theorists. Recognition associated with Axel Honneth, disclosure, nucleus compritis, self-actualization, Yegi, and resonance, Rosa. And I call these concepts experience concepts. And I do so in order to underscore their dual focus on both the general and the particular, on philosophical reflection and life as it is lived. So in other words, experience concepts can hold bigger social and philosophical pictures in sight. They do so, though, without seeing persons as mere shadows cast by all-determining structures. I have a polemic against the idea of structure in this book, freeing up movement between the larger claim and the arresting example or idiosyncratic detail. Experience concepts are crucially transpersonal concepts. They assume the self's interaction with other persons, the non-human world, and cultural forms. And they focus on patterns of experience that are widely shared. A claim that does not require us to kind of drill down to transcendental structures of consciousness a la Kant or Husserl, just an openness to registering similarities as well as differences between persons. And finally, and this is, I hope, the original contribution of the book, I aim to show how these concepts are relevant not only to life, but also to literature, not only to experiences in literature, but also experiences of literature. But today, I say I'm going to focus on resonance. So this book by Rosa has been extraordinarily successful. I took a plane, a couple of years ago, and I picked up a copy of the German news magazine Stern, and it was featured on the front cover. I mean, he's become a major public intellectual. He's not by no means the first person to theorize resonance, but his approach is exceptionally ecumenical. He ranges across, neuropsychology and aesthetics and economics and politics, sociology, phenomenology, and so on. And his declared aim is to radicalize the idea of relation as primordial rather than secondary, and as a source of aliveness and plenitude, as well as alienation or domination. A one-sided stress on emancipation, which of course is a traditional Frankfurt School preoccupation, the gaining of autonomy, the breaking of bonds, cannot account not just for the inescapability of ties, but the value of certain ties. As Rosa says, it's often when we feel least autonomous, when we fall in love or feel overpowered by a work of art or give ourselves over to a religious or political commitment, that we may feel most fulfilled. So to resonate with something, then, is to be affected, touched, or moved, responding with an outwardly directed motion, acting while being acted upon. So there's a kind of bidirectional, or indeed possibly multidirectional oscillation that can involve thoughts, beliefs, and values, but also emotions, perceptions, what's called gut response. Aspects of our relationship to the world are certainly precognitive, though not presocial. And crucially, and this is the normative part of the argument, such experiences of effectively charged meaningfulness are sought after by human beings and highly valued. So as I say, Rosa ranges from Marx to mirror neurons, from Baudelaire to Black Sabbath, he's a kind of heavy metal fan, from smartphones to Schopenhauer, drawing out the many facets of his title word. He describes how the skin can be experienced as a resonant surface, there's a lot of Merleau-Ponty there, the impact of landscape on mood, the passions unleashed at a football match, the collective effervescence of a rock concert. So resonance then involves a dynamic relation between two or more bodies. As one vibrates, another starts to move in a pattern of both repetition and variation. Resonance, though, is not to be confused with consonance or harmony. Resonance means not merging in unity, but encountering another as another. Nor does it require positive feelings, right? We can feel attuned to a melancholic aria, a desolate landscape, a historical site that memorializes suffering. And crucially, it's characterized by a degree of elusiveness and unpredictability. Resonance cannot be forced into being. Even when conditions seem favorable, it may fail to materialize. Our lover's smile may become frozen or petrified. Our cat might not purr. Our favorite music may leave us cold. The forest or the sea might deny us any resonance. So experiencing the world in this way as a relation is contrasted to treating the world as a resource, the language we know, as we all know, of optimizing, maximizing, ratcheting up our productivity. The capitalist imperative towards having more and speeding up filters down to the pores of daily life, Rosa says, such that we come to experience the world as a kind of shark tank where we have to swim faster than others to survive. Crucially, the frantic pursuit of resources diminishes our capacity for resonance. Because when the world is treated as stuff to be appropriated, it's a world that's fallen silent, right? It's a world that comes to appear mute or cold or hollow. Now, some of these ideas might appear to echo, some of the ideas of the early Frankfurt School, the critique of instrumental rationality or capitalism, whatever. But Rosa contrasts his approach in terms of his less bleak perspective. Modernity, insists, can't simply be understood as a catastrophe of resonance. It's also greatly heightened our sensitivities to resonance, and in many respects even produced certain capacities for resonance in the first place. So the weakness of past critical theories, from his viewpoint, is their failure to reckon with this double-sidedness. And he takes strong issue with critiques of attachment to nature or religion or art as nothing more than sentimental evasions of harsher, more fundamental realities. Insofar as such attachments shape our thoughts and feelings, our behaviours, our commitments, they are reality, shaping the fundamental being in the world of late modern subjects. To conceive of human beings as resonance-seeking creatures, then, he insists, is to reorient the focus of critical theory. Now, not only does Rosa devote quite a few pages of the resonance book to the classroom, but he's also co-authored a book, actually I think he's by now co-authored several books on resonance and pedagogy, but this is the only one I happen to have read. It's only available in German. The subtitle is Wenn es im Klassenzimmer knistert, which sort of means when things crackle in the classroom. In other words, when there's a spark in the classroom. And so he says here, when talking about pedagogy, resonance has nothing to do with the kind of, what's called a touchy-feely pedagogy or relentless positivity. That is not resonance. That is an echo chamber. Resonance is not the same as an echo, where prior perceptions are confirmed and the challenge of otherness is avoided. Nor is resonance the enemy of expertise, quite the contrary. A violin will only start to sing after many hours of practice. Latin poetry will only speak to those who are already well versed in Latin. Yet education, he insists, is a semi-controllable experience whose outcomes cannot be nailed down in advance. We never know what awaits us when we walk into a classroom. Will a discussion veer off in unexpected but thought-provoking directions? Or will we encounter closed-off faces and a wall of silence? Or perhaps a random student remark will cause the whole class to dissolve into helpless bouts of laughter. Resonance, in this sense, is a threat to an educational ethos that is increasingly predicated on predictability and, above all, the avoidance of risk. Just recovering from a cold, so I need to take occasional sips of water. So how might these ideas of resonance relate to depictions of enchantment and disenchantment in academic life? So say my first example, Stoner, was published in 1965 when it sold only 2,000 copies before going out of print. Ill-matched, it turned out, to the pop and postmodern sensibilities of the time. How could the shy, nondescript author, there is on the left, writes one critic, compete with Norman Mailer's bravado, Tom Wolfe's white suits and spats, or Philip Roth's Bible to masturbation? But when it was reissued by the New York Review of Books in 2006, Stoner became its most successful reprint. Interest accelerated dramatically after it was translated into French. Reviewers saw it as aligned with European rather than American sensibilities, and anti-Gatsby in its dwelling on failure and disappointment. There was talk of stoner mania. Williams' novel became a bestseller in the Netherlands, Spain, Germany, Israel. It was here in the UK, for those of you who can remember back that far, the Waterstone Book of the Year in 2013, praised by a host of luminaries, Bret Easton Ellis, Jeff Dyer, Ian McEwan, and Julian Barnes. So in Williams' novel, a student from a dirt-poor background wanders into a literature classroom, is shocked into an altered state of consciousness, and will eventually become a professor of English. Even as the pathos of his life unfurls, it's almost comical, actually. I'm like, everything goes wrong for him. A disastrous marriage, a growing alienation from his only daughter, constantly cold-shouldered and scapegoated by his sadistic colleagues. The novel returns repeatedly to the almost painful intensity of a felt connection to books. An excitement, we're told, that was like terror. Kind of an interesting choice of phrase, certainly not, happy, sappy, touchy-feely. And as Stoner is finishing up his undergraduate degree, his teacher invites him into his office and says, well, you really should continue your studies, and do a PhD. But don't you know, Mr. Stoner, Sloane asked, don't you understand that about yourself yet? You're going to be a teacher. Suddenly, Sloane seemed very distant, and the walls of the office receded. Stoner felt himself suspended in the wide air, and he heard his voice ask, are you sure? I'm sure, said Sloane softly. How can you tell? How can you be sure? It's love, Mr. Stoner, Sloane said cheerfully. You're in love. It's as simple as that. So we see here that the protagonist's passivity and lack of self-awareness, which will continue throughout his life. He will remain a stubborn holdout against professionalization, showing no interest in burning, not burning. I didn't mean burning, that's a Freudian slip. No interest in burnishing his resume or advancing his career. But what to make of these references to love, which I think have a tendency to sound rather hackneyed to contemporary ears? Well, I do think this novel is dealing with something that's exceptionally important, but I think that perhaps, Rose's idea of resonance might provide another way into what this important thing is. So, Stoner comes from a farm, a kind of impoverished farm, and so he enrolls for an agriculture degree, so he's about to head back afterwards and run this very modest homestead. And so he enjoys his courses in soil chemistry, but then he's required to take a compulsory course in English. And we're told the required survey of English literature troubled and disquieted him in a way that nothing had ever done before. And he's asked at a pivotal moment in the novel to explain the meaning of a Shakespeare sonnet by his teacher, this guy Sloane. And he struggles in vain to answer, we're told, as if knowing through words what he cannot put into words. A solitary figure on campus, he's drawn to the study of medieval and Renaissance literature, experiencing an intensity of connection with Paolo and Francesco, with Tristan and Isolde, that he's never felt with his peers or his classmates. And as he embarks on his graduate studies, the thrill of intellectual discovery accelerates. He was aware of a constant change within himself, and as he was aware of that, he moved outward from himself into the world which contained him, so that he knew that the poem of Milton's that he read, or the essay of Bacon's, or the drama of Ben Jonson's, changed the world which was its subject, and changed it because of its dependence on it. We see here how a life is indeed transformed by the resonating, the still alive, if you like, words of the dead. But as I said at the start, this is a world away from Dead Poets Society. In other words, the romantic image of the iconoclastic, much-loved teacher. Conscientious rather than charismatic, dutiful, not dramatic, Stoner labours through his life to little avail. Thanks to a feud with his department chair, he's assigned a heavy load of introductory classes, which he teaches without complaint, yet he remains painfully conscious of his inadequacies as a teacher. Those things he held most deeply were most profoundly betrayed when he spoke of them to his classes. What was most alive withered in his words, and what moved him most became cold in its utterance. And his first and only book, meanwhile, is described by reviewers as pedestrian and a competent survey. And his research slowly fizzles out. The achievement of Williams' novel, though, is to transmute what might look like professional failings into aesthetic virtues. What I mean by that is the emotional impassivity of the protagonist is echoed in the self-effacement and restraint of the novel's prose. So the opening pages give us an affectless recounting of the bare facts of Stoner's life and his lack of impact on the world. He did not rise above the rank of assistant professor, and few students remembered him with any sharpness after they'd taken his classes. Stoner's colleagues, who held him in no particular esteem when he was alive, speak of him rarely now. The work of the novel will be to rewrite this devastating assessment of a seemingly invisible and insignificant life. And I think it does, actually. When I've taught this book to students, they're often incredibly moved by it. And yet it does so not by contravening Stoner's restraint, but by adhering to it. He never got into the habit of introspection, we're told, and he found the task of searching his motives a difficult and slightly distasteful one. And this reticence, I'll say, is echoed in the novel's narration, which keeps a distance from the inner world of its characters, while allowing certain details to shimmer forth as luminous moments among the drudgery of routine and disappointment. So, for example, after this pivotal moment when he's asked to explain the meaning of his Shakespeare sonnet and he's unable to speak, this is like what turns him to literature, turns him around, we read the following words. He sat unmoving, staring out before him at the narrow planked flooring that had been worn bare of varnish by the restless feet of students he would never see or know. He slid his own feet across the floor, hearing the dry rasp of wood on his soles and feeling the roughness through the leather. So I think what's noticeable here is what is not said. There's no discussion of love of literature. There's no mention of emotion or sentiment, no attempt to psychologize or rhapsodize, just a dilated consciousness of time, a heightened awareness of his bodily sensations, a keen attunement to his physical surroundings, what indeed we might call, after Rosa, resonance. And another key moment, Stoner's attachment to scholarship, is conveyed in the following words. The mystery of the mind and heart showing themselves in the minute, strange, and unexpected combinations of letters and words, in the blackest and coldest print. And I'm very struck by this particular phrasing, which is, I think, captures the sort of strangely impersonal force of words on the page, which both disclose a reality, but also distance you or defamiliarize you in certain ways, that allow those words to trigger an exhilaration that is indeed like terror. This is exactly, I think, what resonance is about. Everyone knows what it's like, says Rose, and I think he's correct on this point. Everyone knows what it's like when our wire to the world begins to vibrate intensely. Well, we're also familiar with moments of extreme throwness, right? The kind of Heideggerian idea where the world confronts us as hostile and cold. The university for Stoner will come to embody both. Early modern literature serves as a miraculous escape from the life of deadening farm labour to which he would otherwise have been sentenced. Yet due to a lack of interpersonal savvy and a stubborn refusal to conform to the realpolitik of academic life, the university also confronts him as a hostile and alien other. The account of his retirement dinner, as he witnesses with ironic bemusement the empty speeches, faux collegiality, and perfunctory words of congratulation, is perhaps the saddest episode in the book. Now, my second example. An oscillation between resonance and alienation, passionate commitment and intense estrangement is also evident in theory. A novel in which, so this is by the Black Canadian, or actually Black Caribbean resident in Canada, writer, poet, novelist, critic Dion Brand. So this is a novel in which a poet we call here a postgraduate student, reflects on love affairs with three women as they conflict with the demands of a dissertation. This narrator declines to disclose gender or an identity, but a scattering of textual clues suggests she's indeed a woman of colour. Veering from Barthes to Adorno, from Said to Zizek, she rails against the insufferable institution of the university, even as the dissertation recedes ever further from completion. And like Stoner, Brand's novel shows how intellectual commitments are enabled, but also imperilled by the university. I can especially identify with this remark. One has no friends in academia. One has colleagues. One has assassins. Its opening pages detail the horrified reaction of the narrator's brother as he enters her apartment to find papers and books covering the entire floor, as well as the tables and sofas and everything. The detritus of a dissertation started 12 years earlier and not yet finished. The title alone undergoes endless revision. Should it be Gender's Genealogies, the Sight of the Subaltern, a Foucauldian reading? Or perhaps The Mask of Gender, a Fanonian critique? 3 torn-up versions are buried in a kitchen drawer amidst the spoons and scotch tape. The latest draft exceeds 700 pages. So this novel is a reckoning with the unfinished dissertation and, as I say, love affairs with 3 women. The beautiful and self-absorbed Selah, Yara, who's a performer and political activist, Odalist from Colombia with her interest in spirituality and statues of tribal gods. To what extent do the affairs distract from the research, or does critical theory serve rather as a refuge from the messiness of relationships? The narrator's skills in interpretation, she admits, utterly fail her when it comes to deciphering her lovers. And yet academic relations are equally challenging to navigate. There's an ongoing power struggle with her advisor, a Habermasian whose, quote, rancid and life-sucking ideas are portrayed as hostile to her own. Meanwhile, a rival graduate student, a shark-like deconstructionist, glides smoothly through academic waters, parlaying intellectual skills into professional success in a way that our narrator cannot manage. Her political views are a world away from Stoner's quietism. What they do share, though, is a sense of apartness. Both are portrayed as estranged from their milieu. All my life, writes this narrator, and I think Stoner could say this too, I've sat at an angle observing the back and forth of other people's lives. I dare say I sit at this angle towards my own life. What is particularly interesting, again, formally here, is this kind of nexus of affinity and estrangement. I'm going to talk more about the affinity in a minute, the affinity towards ideas and academia. But this kind of shifting back and forth between affinity and estrangement is also formally actualized in the way in which the novel manipulates our relationship to its main protagonist. You know, should we sympathize with this protagonist? Are we put off by her? So, for example, her account of graduate school nails down with wit and exactitude the sense of isolation and anxiety, the sparring and posturing. She describes the trading of multisyllabic words and esoteric concepts in her study group, the cachet gained by quoting a French theorist in French, or even better, an unknown Romanian, arguments that flash like gleaming switchblades. Meanwhile, she and her dissertation committee, she remarks, live in different worlds. Her existence as a woman of colour is shaped by their unseeing. These professors were not conservatives by any means. They were left-wing scholars, social theorists. But they knew, and I knew, that academia was a place for perpetuating class and class privilege. And yet inclinations by readers towards solidarity or sympathy might well be tempered by this narrator's erratic perceptions and grandiose claims. She continues to insist the dissertation is close to completion, even though she's long disenrolled, her committee disbanded, her advisor dead. Remarking that her brain is faster than the Academy allows, she's convinced that her committee want to steal her ideas. Language and thought, the world will be changed after my dissertation, she preens. The whole field of gender will be revolutionized. And at times she plunges into a stream of invective that might remind you, depending on your own reading list, of, say, Jamaica Kincaid or Thomas Bernhardt. I was wasting all my light on this insufferable institution that was the university, academia, and my cretinous colleagues and the trolls of the ruling class who were my professors. It had become increasingly impossible to express a single original idea without these Neanderthals wanting to weigh down like a sycophant with the drivel that had come before. Alienation, then, in abundance. And yet the narrator also testifies to the all-engrossing nature of the pursuit of ideas. I have sufficient material for a lifetime of theory, she writes. The work energizes me. Always, each time I return to it, I'm opened up anew to how necessary it is to any future living. In a fit of melancholy, she reflects on the half-read texts scattered around the apartment, how her girlfriends kept her from finishing The Phenomenology of Mind or reading Lukács, yet how much of her life is captured in the pages of books. A French critic reminds her of her time with Yara. All of our being together, she writes, is contained in references to Roland Barthes. So I can't get rid of Barthes. I think this shows very powerfully how ideas are not separate from the world, but are folded into the living of a life. What looks like a chaos of papers in her apartment, she says, is the breathing room I've made between myself and the dread. The narrator is lifted up by the exhilaration of wrestling with difficult ideas. My thesis, qua thesis, was a pleasure to me. Anyone would think I found it difficult. Well, I did find it difficult, but not only difficult. Sometimes I would lie on the floor among my books and among the realm of papers I'd produced, and I would feel a purity, a breathless purity. And we see here very well, in line with the kind of thing that Rosa argues, how the intellectual bleeds into the physical and the emotional. As this narrator is lifted up, right, by a physical proximity to her books and papers, nestling among her own words. A Goodreads reviewer writes, Brand delights in capturing the fragile and haughty ego of academia, the self-absorption and the complete lack of practical follow-through. Another comment, he really encapsulates how all-consuming academia is, specifically academia that deals with theory or literature. It's like being in this weird bubble where you know there's more to life, but it's also your and everybody else's entire life. We see here how Brand's novel sparks moments of recognition in certain readers by crystallizing the form and feel of a certain milieu. As I said earlier, Rose insists, especially in the case of literature, that alienation is not simply opposed to resonance, but intertwined with it. So, for example, especially modern literature often dwells on disenchantment, but translates it into alluring aesthetic form. Similarly, Brand's novel does not just portray resonance, it also engenders it. And I've just got about 2.5 more pages and I'll be done. Let me just try and pull some of this a bit together. That these two novels, Theory and Stone, are centre on academic outsiders seems crucial to the questions they raise about the stakes of humanistic study. As I asked earlier, to what extent does their experience of failure provide insight into the limits of what now counts as success? Who are the winners in an increasingly corporate academic milieu that's driven, in Rosa's words, by constant acceleration, by this language of research outputs, input factors, learning outcomes, citation indexes, global benchmarks? Certainly not the late starter or rough diamond, not the misfit or the maladroit. As someone who got a quite mediocre degree from Cambridge, it would be impossible for me to actually get into graduate school under current conditions. Our protagonists, these two figures I've introduced you to, experience the movement of thought as a dynamic resonance, yet cannot translate it into a resource. They do not advance professionally, even as the life of the mind remains for them the only livable life. And against this background, interestingly, Stoner is now being read as a prescient foreshadowing, remember it came out in the 1960s, of current academic conditions. When critic refers to its prophetic view of a system where it's information rather than knowledge that's becoming the main currency, and where intellectual integrity is giving way to institutional savviness and project managing skills. Another admires the novel's evocation of the dark and unpredictable energy of words, as being impossible to square with bullet point lists of learning outcomes. Bryan's theory, moreover, offers even more forceful riposte to a culture of entrepreneurship and achievement. The PhD student not as a savvy networker and smooth operator, but as a stubborn objector who disdains deadlines and spars incessantly with her committee. The 12-year dissertation is the scenario that haunts every dean of postgraduate studies, the ultimate exemplar of slow reading and writing, of a refusal to be pliant and compliant, to buckle down and get it done. And precisely because it's an intrinsically relational concept, right? Resonance is not about emotions, it's not about inner feelings, it's about dynamics, if you like. Resonance alerts us then to the many factors that affect its absence or presence. Here, obviously, it's not just a matter of what goes on in a classroom, but also the guiding values of institutions. There's a homepage devoted to research and teaching or sports teams and donor opportunities, as well, of course, as economic and political pressures, increasing injunctification in the US especially, but I gather also increasingly here, skyrocketing tuition. So the idea of resonance then offers a counter-value to a view of education as nothing more than skills acquisition and information transmission. Such a view mistakes drastically how learning happens, as involving not just knowledge accumulation, but also the risk of self-transformation, and as a process whose outcomes cannot be nailed down in advance. Now, of course, there is nothing pure about resonance. Like anything else, it can be instrumentalized and commodified. Buy yourself resonance, writes, this is Rosa again, is the implicit siren song of nearly all advertising campaigns and sales pitches. Get spring freshness in your bathroom with a shower gel. Awaken the forces of nature within you with a pill or yoga class. Become a good father or lover by reading this book or signing up for this course. Experience history up close with weekend discounts at the History Museum. The longing for energizing connection is easily rerouted into the buying of ever more stuff. And the idea of resonance, moreover, I think, as we all know, is increasingly used and abused in the workplace. It's no longer enough to carry out one's duties. We are now expected to do what we love, to advertise our passion for our work. Yoga, wellness seminars, mindfulness training have become buzzwords in even the stodgiest corporations. Meanwhile, at my local airport, an advertisement for an employment agency tells me that jobs have now been superseded by journeys. In the US context, moreover, resonance is often heavily stratified, associated with the boutique education of the pricey liberal arts college rather than the massive lecture halls of the state university. But this is not an argument against resonance, of course, but against its unequal distribution. That resonance does not, cannot entirely escape such economic or political pressures does not mean it's not worth striving for, Rosa insists. Every resonant experience inherently contains an element of excess that allows a different form of relating to the world to shine forth. Both Stoner and theory, I hope I've shown, attend to this shining forth. They capture moments of intellectual exhilaration and aliveness without idealizing either their deeply flawed protagonists or the milieu, the academic milieu in which they find themselves. Taken together, I think these two books capture attachments to both literature and theory as forms of engagement that combine thought and feeling and that cannot be reduced to purely instrumental ends. Perhaps the idea of a resonance can highlight their affinities as well as their differences, while allowing both critics and theorists to push back against the reduction of education to a mere resource. Thank you very much.